Do you remember when gas cost less than $1 per liter? That was back in the early thousands. Today it averages around $1.30, $1.50 per liter, depending on where you live. Or do you remember McDonald's had a coupon that read 2 can dine for $8.99? Well, that same coupon today advertises that 2 can dine for like $20. Another example, my parents, born in the 1970s, they bought a 3-bedroom bungalow for under $200,000 in the early 2000s, and a comparable house today sells for nearly $1 million. So everyone can relate to the pain of watching prices rise, because increasing prices are not isolated anomalies, they're better described as the result of inflation. So in this video, we will examine in depth the multiple layers of that very subject, inflation. And we'll start off with a very simple definition, and then step by step, through building on that understanding, we'll branch out into more advanced concepts that are related to inflation, like how inflation is caused, the different types of inflation, how to identify the different types of inflation, what effects inflation has on individuals and economies as a whole, what central banks have to do with inflation, and on and on. So this video is not intended to simply be an overview or just a recap of inflation. This is an in-depth analysis. So let's now begin with a simple definition of inflation. Inflation is a sustained increase in the general level of prices. And to give you a bit of confidence on the validity of that simple definition, let me just read out some of the other simple definitions from what I consider to be generally reliable websites. So for example, Wikipedia's definition reads, inflation is an increase in the average price of goods and services in terms of money. Investopedia's definition reads, inflation is an increase in the average price of goods and services over time, which reduces the purchasing power of money. And lastly, Merriam-Webster's definition reads, a continuing rise in the general price level usually attributed to an increase in the volume of money and credit relative to available goods and services. But let's go back to this simple definition, because I just want you to focus on this core idea that inflation is a sustained increase in the general level of prices. And even more simply put than that, it's when prices increase. Now, it's generally agreed upon that when prices rise, it's not pleasant. That's because nobody wants to spend more money than they have to. They'd rather spend fewer dollars on the goods and services that they need so that they can spend more dollars on the goods and services that they want. So this is exactly why inflation is such a significant issue and topic of debate. It is inflation which causes you to have to exchange more and more dollars for the same amount of goods and services. Now, you could argue against this depending on your personal situation, that is your income, your employment, and the assets you hold. But for now, let's just go through a few different scenarios which will demonstrate how inflation affects individuals differently based on the different scenarios that people are in. And keep in mind that these scenarios are very isolated, and some of you who have a more advanced understanding, you might find that these scenarios lack nuance. But for the sake of demonstration, just stick with me for now. So let's imagine that you are a business owner and you notice that you're in an inflationary period. So that means you realize that the price of goods and services that you need, like the price of food, housing, maybe some of the accounting services that you need in order to run your business, they're all increasing in price. And your reaction to that might simply be to increase the price of the good or service that you sell or provide, which in turn would earn you more revenue. And in that case, as long as you're reacting to increasing prices by proportionally increasing your revenue, then there's no harm done. Because if a cup of coffee costs $5 today and $10 tomorrow, you can just increase the price of the good or service that you provide, and both of those values your income and your expenses, they will climb relative to each other. But now think of someone who is earning salary. They sign a contract to earn $80,000 per year, and it works out that their monthly expenses consume like 99% of their monthly income. So if prices inflate, it could be disastrous for this person on salary. And even though this person earns consistent monthly income from that $80,000 salary, as prices rise, the income that they do earn is able to provide them with less goods and services which they need in order to live. So that could mean less food to feed their families with, less resources for their kids in school, and all of that. That would be the effect for this person on salary. Now, because everyone's situation is unique and different, by exploring these different situations, you'll find that inflation isn't always as negative or positive as equally for all types of people. So these are very simple scenarios, but it should give you insight into how differently inflation could affect someone whose income is more flexible, like that business owner example, versus someone whose income is more fixed, like someone on a salary. But there are even more examples that we can explore, which will give us an even more advanced understanding of the different types of effects of inflation. So for example, we can discover that inflation is actually beneficial in some sense to someone who owns a tangible asset, like a house, for example. So if inflation occurs in the economy, meaning the prices of goods and services increase, that would mean that the price of a house will also increase, meaning that when that homeowner decides to sell their house, they'll be able to sell it at a higher price. Now, of course, yes, you might be thinking, okay, but the dollars that they earn from selling their house won't go as far as they did before the inflationary period. They won't be able to exchange their dollars for as many goods or services as before. And that's true. I want you to focus on the general idea here, which is that for someone who owns a tangible asset, during a period of inflation, the price of their asset increases. So that's how inflation might affect someone who has purchased and owns a tangible asset. But now we can ask, how would inflation affect someone who is in debt and is owing money? So let's imagine someone is in debt, perhaps someone paying a mortgage on a house. And let's imagine, for convenience, a really simple and hypothetical situation where a person, let's call this person Adam. Adam purchases a home for $500,000. And Adam works at a factory and his annual salary is $100,000. And he plans to contribute his entire salary to paying off his mortgage for 5 years, meaning in 5 years, he'll have contributed $500,000 toward paying off this $500,000 mortgage. So it will be completely paid off by that time. Okay, so in the first year after Adam has purchased his home, let's imagine there's a period of significant inflation and the price of goods and services increase drastically, but Adam's home, it's already been purchased. So the price of his home remains at $500,000. Now we can think of Adam's employer, and let's call him John. He's the owner of the factory that Adam works at. And John understands that the prices of goods and services have increased. So that means that the price of the machinery that John needs to purchase for his factory has also increased. And John then increases the price of the products that he manufactures. So he's generating more revenue to cover that cost. And because of this increase in revenue, John is able to pay Adam a higher wage, okay? Understanding that Adam will also have to purchase goods and services which are now at an increased price. Okay, so now Adam, instead of earning $100,000 a year, his salary jumps to $250,000 a year. So with this new salary, Adam is able to pay his entire mortgage off in significantly less time than he would have been able to otherwise. Interestingly enough, someone who has debt is pleased when inflation occurs because their debt to income ratio will decrease, meaning that the burden of their debt will decrease. So those are examples of inflation having a beneficial outcome, but more often than not, the outcome is negative, and I'll demonstrate an example of that now. So let's imagine someone who has saved up cash for a planned expense. For example, I've saved $2,000, all of which are sitting in my checking account, and I'm planning to use those dollars on a vacation. So when I started saving, my projections informed me that $2,000 would pay for my flights, my hotel, all of my meals, all my activities. Although, unfortunately for me, by the time I've saved my cash, those items cannot all be purchased with only $2,000. And moreover, let's just imagine I get heavily involved in a 6-month-long project at work, and I have to delay my vacation. So my $2,000 saved will be able to purchase me even less by the time I actually get around to using that cash. So you can see that inflation being an increase in the price of goods and services over time, it will affect different people in different ways based on their financial position, their assets, their income, their expenses, and all of that. So now that we've explored the ways in which inflation could be advantageous or disadvantageous to varying people, let's go back to our simple definition and add on to it using the knowledge that we've just gained. So previously we defined inflation as a sustained increase in the general level of prices, but we can now define and think of inflation in another way. Inflation is a sustained increase in the level of prices and a sustained decline in the purchasing power of money. Now, purchasing power, as you might have already gathered from some of the examples up to this point, it's a way to measure the value that you can actually exchange your money for. And on the topic of value, this is where things start to get a little bit confusing because we realize how intangible and arbitrary money really is. And it's difficult to determine how valuable or powerful money is because, after all, money isn't exciting, but the things you can exchange for money, those are exciting. So at any rate, purchasing power, the value of money, it's a crucial term to understand if you want to have a strong grasp on inflation. So on that note, let me just break down purchasing power a bit. Okay, so let's say you have a $100 bill, and I say, what is the value of that $100 bill? Obviously, it's $100, but what does that really mean? So is the $100 so valuable that you could exchange it for a new pair of winter boots? Or could you only exchange it for a pair of flip-flops? Could you exchange it for a bottle of really nice whiskey and a steak? Or could you only exchange it for a salad and a glass of milk or something? So the reality is that money's not exciting. The things that are truly exciting, that are valuable, are the goods or services that you can exchange for our money. So once we realize that, we can understand that money is just an opportunity to obtain true value. So going back to purchasing power, the term purchasing power is perhaps a more objective way to determine the value of money, or that $100 bill that you have in your wallet. So now if someone asks you, what is the value of your $100 bill? You can tell them how much purchasing power that $100 bill has. And in that way, the value of money can be more easily understood, arbitrary as the numbers may be. So at this point in the video, you should have a grasp on the definition of inflation: prices rising, purchasing power decreasing. You should also have a grasp on the effects of inflation, what it does to different people. So since you know what it does, it causes your dollars to not go as far as they once did, you can now conceptualize the effects that inflation might have on an individual or an entire economy. But at this point, I think the next step in truly understanding inflation is just to explore the question Why does inflation happen? And unfortunately, since rising prices is such a pillar of understanding inflation, explaining how the prices actually rise often gets overlooked. So let's spend some time figuring out why inflation occurs. And a little spoiler alert, inflation isn't caused by greedy capitalists trying to oppress the working class with higher prices. So in order to understand why inflation occurs, let's just explore an example. So let's imagine there are two islands in the middle of the ocean, and they're identical except for one attribute. So both islands, each island has 10 people, each island has 10 coconuts. There are no other resources on the island. There's no coconuts growing. There's no other food. It's just 10 people and 10 coconuts. So one coconut for each resident on each island. The only difference between these two islands is the amount of money present. So island A has $100 total, split evenly between its residents, meaning that each resident has $10. And island B has $200 total, split evenly between its residents, meaning each resident has $20. So the residents on each island want to set a price for the coconuts, and they agree on a pricing structure. So to the residents, one coconut should be worth 50% of what each individual resident holds in money. And because this pricing structure is percentage based, the pricing structure can be applied to both islands evenly. So now we know that the islands are identical. The pricing structure is percentage based. The only difference is the amount of money present. Now, let's think about the price of a coconut on each island. So thinking about island A, where each resident owns $10, one coconut is worth $5, right? Because 50% of $10 is $5. On island B, where each resident owns $20, one coconut is worth $10, as 50% of $20 is $10. So the islands are identical in all aspects except for the amount of money present. And this variable alone determines the price of a coconut. And notice that the worth of a coconut, that being 50% of what a resident holds in cash, that hasn't changed. So you can imagine what would happen if there were a third island with $300 present, while each coconut would be priced at $15. So this is due to a simple truth, and that's that when the money supply increases and the quantity of goods remains fixed, prices rise in proportion to maintain the same relative value. So the adjustment is simply mathematical. It has nothing to do with greedy sellers increasing prices, trying to maximize profit and oppress people, etc. Now scale this to an entire economy in a given country. We can imagine if a country, let's say the country where I live, Canada, adds hundreds of millions of dollars to the money supply through stimulus checks, other programs, whatever. The prices of goods and services would proportionally increase, just like the price of coconuts increased on the islands as the amount of dollars increased on each island. Now, I'm using this term money supply, which simply means the amount of money in a country. It's not necessarily the amount of value or wealth that a country has. It's simply a measure of the amount of units of money that there are in a given country. And going back to the island example, the islands all had different money supplies. So island A had $100, island B had $200, the third island presumably $300. The value present, the useful thing that the useless money was being exchanged for, was still only 10 coconuts. So as a result of this coconut thought experiment, we have a general understanding that the money supply has something to do with inflation, and more specifically, that as money supply grows and the amount of goods and services stays stagnant, then prices increase. But let's now explore in more depth the different technical ways that inflation will manifest. So beginning with what is called demand pull inflation. This type of inflation occurs when aggregate demand in an economy outpaces aggregate supply. That is to say that there is more demand for goods and services than the producers of those goods and services can keep up with. So this means there are a lot of dollars out there and not enough coconuts to supply the people with. Now, the cause of this type of inflation is pretty straightforward. It starts with an increase in money supply. So perhaps the government provides stimulus checks or initiates new programs. Either interest rates are lowered, which would make credit and loans more accessible, or for some reason, consumer confidence just increases in general, causes people to want to spend more. So the idea here is that consumers have more cash and a bigger desire to spend it and get stuff. Now, on the other side of the scenario, the suppliers can't keep up with the demand. So suppliers are trying to keep product on the shelves. Service providers, they're trying to keep their schedules open for bookings. Whatever they try, they just can't keep up with these spend crazy consumers in the population. So what is the reaction of producers and sellers in this case? They recognize the increase in demand and they allow prices to rise until balance is achieved. So let me break down exactly what I mean by that. Because these consumers have an increase in cash, that is to say more cash at hand, they're willing to buy more goods and services. It also means that these consumers are likely willing to compete against other consumers to be the few who have the opportunity to buy those goods and services. So I'll explain. Just imagine you and I each have $5 and we meet for donuts. And the cafe sells donuts for a pleasant $1 per. But unfortunately, there's only one donut in the pastry case. We both want a donut. There's two of us. So there's a lot of demand for that donut, but only one donut to supply the demand with. So what ends up happening is we start to bid against each other. So you consider paying $2 for that donut, which is essentially $1 for the actual product and another dollar to coax the seller to sell the donut to you, but not to me. Then I bring my offering and I'm willing to pay $5 for the donut. So $1 for the actual product and $4 to ensure that the donut is sold to me and not to you. And the donut seller in this case might logically think, since people are willing to pay $5 for a donut, I should set the price to $5 to ensure that the donuts only go to the people who truly want them, to the people who indicate their strong desire for the donut by sacrificing not $1, but $5 to have it. Another more practical reason why prices might increase as consumers have more cash and a bigger desire to spend is so that producers will have time to produce. So if goods and services begin to rise in price, more and more consumers will be discouraged from purchasing them since they might want to save their dollars for another purpose that's more valuable to them. So it is through this mechanism of discouragement that producers allot themselves time to produce goods and services. Now, if consumers are willing to purchase goods and services faster than goods and services can be produced, then an increase in price, that is a discouragement to purchase, that will balance out that disparity. So that's a little bit about demand pull inflation. And there's another type of inflation called cost push inflation. So this occurs when the cost of producing a good or service rises independently of demand and forces producers to increase prices as a way to sustainably pay for the increased cost of production. So let's imagine that you and I are in the habit of purchasing coffee beans to make coffee. So one year in South America, where we purchase our coffee beans from, there is a severe drought, and the farmer who grows the beans is forced to pay out of pocket for mass amounts of water to hydrate that crop. So this means that producing the coffee beans, it's much more expensive for that farmer. In turn, the farmer increases the price of the final products, that's the bags of coffee beans, so that that farmer can avoid earning negative revenue. And as a result, you and I end up paying more for those coffee beans. So a good practice, if you want to get in the habit of thinking economically, is to consider when you're confronted with higher prices than usual, consider where along the production line the price originated. And that is to say, just because you end up paying more for a final product, which is the coffee beans, it doesn't necessarily mean that the seller of coffee beans is receiving more profit. It just means that the higher costs are now being covered by higher prices. So only when you are at the end of the line do you truly notice a higher price. Because if you were to turn around and sell coffee made from the coffee beans, you would sell the coffee at a price appropriate to cover the cost of whatever you paid for those coffee beans. That is the cost of production. And finally, there is a third cause of inflation that we'll examine. It's called built-in inflation. And this cause of inflation is peculiar and interesting, I think, because it is more so based on expectations of reality than it is based on reality itself. So built-in inflation occurs when workers or the working class, they observe that prices are rising. And as a reaction to that observation, they demand higher wages from their employers in order to maintain their standards of living. So as a result of this increase in the cost of labor for producers, they in turn increase the price of their final product to adequately cover the cost of inflation. Now, consumers in the economy observe that the goods and services that are produced are now at an increased price, and the cycle from that point begins all over again, and it continues in a downward spiral. So because of this, we can see that inflation, it's not only caused by factors that are in reality, but by imagined factors in reality. So in addition to all of this vicious cycle of built-in inflation, when consumers observe that prices are rising, they might be encouraged to panic buy in order to purchase goods at a lower price than what they can presume the same goods will be priced at in the future, and they may hoard goods. So both of those behaviors can have a negative effect on the economy. Why? Panic buying is an example of demand outpacing supply, causing demand pull inflation. And hoarding is an example of goods being misallocated to a storage closet when they could be benefiting someone who needs to use them at that moment. So now that we have a solid grasp on what causes inflation, the different ways it can show up in an economy, I think the next natural question is, how can inflation be objectively measured? So the answer to that question lies in understanding that inflation as a metric is a representation. It's not something you can directly see or touch. It's just a carefully calculated statistic based on tracking the prices of a specific set of goods and services over time. So up until this point in the video, we've been speaking about the mechanism of inflation, the effect it has on people, the factors that cause inflation. Those are more real and tangible things which can be observed and experienced. Now, unfortunately, as we become more precise in our measurement of inflation, we equally become more imprecise, because although a calculation is very exact, a calculation can't always take into account factors that are changing and liquid throughout time. So at any rate, let's walk through how the calculation works, and I'll point out where it fails to accurately represent reality. So the primary way inflation is measured is through what is called the Consumer Price Index, also known as CPI. So the Consumer Price Index is designed to answer one question, and that's how much more or less does it cost the average consumer to buy a fixed set or a basket of goods and services compared to a previous period in time. Now, the fixed set or basket of goods and services isn't random. It's meant to represent what a typical household purchases on a regular basis. So some examples of items in this set are shelter, so things like rent or mortgage interest, transportation like gas, cars, public transit, food items, so groceries, eating out at restaurants, household operations, furniture, utilities, as well recreation, clothing, education. Those are also present in the set. So not only does the set include a lot of different items that households typically purchase, but each item is weighted differently to accurately reflect the proportional spending of a common household. So what that means is if the price of something critical and common like housing increases, it will have a larger effect on the calculation of inflation than if the price of rock climbing, which is just an obscure leisure-related expense, were to increase. Now, the consumer price index is only one way of calculating inflation, and there are other indices which exist which aim to track different sets of purchases. So, for example, the producer price index, or PPI, tracks the price that producers pay for their inputs, which are commonly items like steel or oil or wheat. And the producer price index is especially useful because it can be used to project the consumer price index. Because as we learned earlier, the cost of production is often transferred to consumers in the price of a final product. So when it actually comes to performing the calculation, how does that work? You simply take an index, so in this case we'll do CPI, and you compare it to another CPI from another period in time. So Canada's CPI for 2023 was 157.1. It was 160.9 in 2024. So first we'll divide the newer CPI by the older CPI. So we'll divide 2024 as 160.9 by 2023 is 157.1. And our answer should be 1.0241. Then we can subtract 1, so we should get 0.0241. And then multiply that 100 by 100 rather, and our answer should be 2.41. So now we can say that the inflation rate from 2023 to 2024 was 2.41%. You could also say that the consumer price index rose 2.4% on a year-over-year basis from the 2023 average to the 2024 average. That'd be another way to say it. Now, the difficult thing is that a simple percentage is difficult to translate into a situation in reality. I personally find it more effective to just see the price change from year to year. Let's say, for example, like the price of coffee. It's $5 for a cappuccino, then $6 for a cappuccino. I find that more effective than having to conceptualize. Okay, the consumer price index rose 2.4% on a year-over-year basis from the 2023 average to the 2024 average. It just works better for my brain. The important thing to note here is that the inflation calculation is just that. It's just a calculation. There are a number of nuances of human behavior in the face of inflation that a simple calculation doesn't really capture. And an example of that is the nuance of substitution. So let's imagine an inflationary period where the price of cappuccinos increases. So if you find that cappuccinos are very expensive, you might just switch to drinking drip coffee to save dollars. But the consumer price index would assume that you buy the same set of items every single month. So meaning that if cappuccinos get expensive, you just weather the storm and buy them anyway. Now, the truth is that people tend to purchase what is effective and valuable for them to purchase. They substitute. Now, another nuance is the fact that products often improve over time and become more worth having and increase in price as a result. So, for example, the technology in cars advances, the technology in phones advances, and so on and so forth. But the consumer price index doesn't track and calculate all of these improvements and changes and weigh them against the price changes. It just tracks the price changes. So it's important to remember that this calculation is just that. It's just a calculation. It is useful, however, to explore data and to try to find increased specificity. So for example, finding inflation rates by country, then by region, and then comparing different indices. So having an objective metric can often bring clarity, but it can't be forgotten that behind every calculation is an instance in reality comprised of human behavior made up of incentives and trade-offs. So that's a little bit of insight into how the calculation actually works, and that should shed light on the fact that the inflation rate, which is a simple number, is representative of a more complex reality. Up until this point, we've mainly explored inflation as it relates to an individual and within small economies, hypothetical situations. And while the economy is an aggregate of individuals and their transactions, it's worth considering what inflation does to the economy as a whole. It is generally believed that moderate or appropriate inflation lubricates economic growth, whereas extreme inflation or too little inflation, or the opposite of inflation, deflation, has a negative effect on the economy. So I want us now to explore the effects on inflation on the economy as a whole by conceptualizing what effects varying degrees of inflation would have on an economy. So firstly, let's think about target inflation. This is like the Goldilocks zone of inflation, the rate at which relatively little damage is done, and the net result of inflation is generally beneficial to the economy and people in the given country. So typically within an economy, there is a central bank, whether it's the Bank of Canada, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and that central bank attempts to maintain the rate of inflation at a target, typically around 2%. Now, this is usually surprising to someone learning about inflation because the overall consensus is that inflation is inherently bad. The benefit of inflation can be found, though, when a predictable environment, which harbors economic growth, is created as a result of a specific inflation rate. So let's explore different levels of inflation starting from low to high. You can imagine the implications of a 0% inflation rate and whether or not that would contribute to a growing economy. Well, if there's no inflation at all, prices aren't ever rising. There is no incentive for consumers to spend in the near future since their money is guaranteed to have the same purchasing power now as it will in the future. So as a result, economic growth slows due to a decrease in spending. Even worse than 0% inflation is deflation, which is additionally harmful to an economy since it further incentivizes consumers to delay their spending and wait for prices to continue to drop. However, if inflation is at a moderate rate, something like 2%, then prices slowly rise such that consumers, they're not terrified into hoarding, but they're encouraged to spend in the present as opposed to in the future. And more attractive and beneficial than hoarding cash is spending cash on worthwhile investments, like on items which will make production more efficient and of higher quality, or on items which will improve the quality of one's life. So once inflation gets high, over 5, 6, 7%, that's when things start becoming more and more unpredictable, which is negative for the economy. So we can imagine a case where inflation climbs to 10% one year, 15% the next. It becomes difficult for businesses to plan in that situation. The cost of raw minerals used for production might increase drastically in half a year. So the question is it worth stockpiling inventory? Is it worth taking out a loan for expansion? How much risk do long-term contracts now pose to a business signing off on them? So in that case, if you were within an economy trying to decide where to place your capital, you might be more incentivized to invest in shorter term opportunities. So that could apply overly burdensome demand pressures to producers and suppliers, and we know the effect of that. It's more inflation. So as a result, not only does this unpredictable and high inflation reduce purchasing power significantly, it creates a state of chaos that erodes confidence in currency and reduces efficiency. So just imagine how much extra work in aggregate a country would have to facilitate if each business had to constantly update their prices and pricing structure. It's very inefficient and it ends up costing a lot of money. So you can see that too little inflation causes problems, too much inflation also causes problems, and between the two extremes is a level which causes the least amount of problems. In addition to all of this, it's important to note that inflation doesn't affect everybody equally. So inflation has the power to widen gaps even further, and you can see that by just conceptualizing an example. So let's say there are two households. There's the Smith household and the Locke household. And the Smith household earns high income. They own $1 million home with a fixed mortgage, and they have an investment portfolio of stocks. So during an inflationary period, the Smith's home will rise in value, causing a gain. Their stock portfolio will additionally rise in value, and their debt owed on their fixed mortgage will actually shrink relative to their money supply. Now, thinking about the Locke house, they earn a lower income and an hourly wage. They save a bit of cash month to month. And during an inflationary period, their rent will increase. Their daily purchases like groceries, transportation, all of that will increase, and their wage will likely fall behind the inflation rate. So if you think of those effects and then you compound them over 5 years or 10 years, the gap between those two households widens. So the economy and households and individuals within that economy will not have the same response to inflation at all times. However, if inflation is moderate, the predictability causes for a more even benefit across the board. So in the face of inflation, we might be wondering, what can be done about inflation? Can it be mitigated or resolved? And exploring that question will bring us back to the topic of central banks. So central banks have an ability to influence inflation by effectively adjusting the price of money. More accurately, since central banks, they don't set the price of goods or services or the price of money, we could say that they set the interest rate, which is the rate at which banks lend. So this is a single lever which affects the entire financial system. It influences borrowing, spending, investment, and in the end, it influences the prices of goods and services. So you can think of it as engineering in a sense, or just tinkering with a machine and tweaking the levers such that the results are altered as per the desire. So if you raise the interest rate, you raise the cost of credit, and in turn, you reduce the velocity of money, which would cool demand and lower inflation. So remember, when demand slows, producers have a chance to catch up. And as there is abundance of goods and services, the incentive on sellers to lower prices increases. They want to keep product moving. So let's think through an example of this in action. We can imagine that there is an adjustment in the interest rate. Let's say the Bank of Canada makes an increase to the interest rate. So this means the cost of credit increases. This would mean that commercial banks then adjust accordingly because they're now paying more to borrow. So this cost passes on and the rate charged to customers equally rises. So credit card rates, lines of credit, variable mortgages, that follow suits. And as a result, borrowing generally becomes more expensive. So mortgage payments increase as more and more dollars are allocated to the interest. And as a result, spending starts to slow down. So people start cutting back on eating out at restaurants, going shopping, purchasing new tools and household items, or investing into their side businesses. Then businesses react to this, and perhaps they react by executing job cuts or delaying hiring. So in general, The total amount of spending and consuming falls, which causes producers and sellers to have excess capacity, which they desperately want to sell off to sustain their cash flow. So eventually, businesses apply discounts to that product, and the price of goods and services start to drop in order to encourage consumers to start spending again. At this point, the central bank can monitor the data and decide whether they want to perform the same move again, maintain their position, reverse their position. They can analyze and react accordingly. Now, this is a very slow process. It's like 12 to 18 months. And in reality, the cost of adjustments are the jobs of everyday people. So you have to imagine that as spending slows, businesses start to look for ways to cut costs. And whether you think it's fair or not, a quick and easy way for people to cut costs is to cut jobs. So it's through this mechanism that the rate of inflation in an economy is fine-tuned. So let's turn to an example of inflation getting out of hand. And I'm not going to go into so much detail with this because my goal isn't to give you a history lesson as much as it is for us to just uncover the cause and effect relationship within this case example. So we can think of Germany's intense inflation between 1921 and 1923, the obnoxious money printing as well that followed suit. So during the First World War, Germany financed their efforts through borrowing and printing. So after the war, the Treaty of Versailles imposed 132 billion gold marks in reparations on Germany. So as the payments began, Germany printed marks to purchase more foreign currency. So the money supply grew rapidly. Prices started to double like every few months. So as Germany began to miss payments, the situation gets worse. France occupies a portion of Germany. Germany decides to pay workers who were striking in those areas, striking in resistance. They pay their workers with more printed money. So the money supply is going up like 1,000,000% year over year. And by November of 2023, $1 is worth like trillions of marks. And the housewives who carry baskets of cash to the grocery store to purchase bread end up having the baskets stolen because they're more useful, more valuable than the trillions of marks that the baskets contain. So the result of Germany's intense money printing was this hyperinflation and a collapse in the currency. So trust in cash disappeared, and tangible items like baskets or cigarettes, they became more useful as currency. So in other words, tangible items became more trustworthy and more representative of true value than cash. So inflation is an interesting power. It spawns all sorts of variants, different ways to combat whatever the cause of inflation is, whether it's demand pull, cost push, or built-in inflation. And as a result, we can observe disguised inflation or inflation combined with other generally negative economic forces. So what am I talking about here? Well, shrinkflation would be an example of what I'm getting at. It's a sinister effect that manifests as a result of individuals or businesses trying to combat the effects that cause inflation in the first place. So for example, do you remember when you would open up a bag of chips and the bag would actually be full of chips? Why is it that now you open up a bag of chips and you need a telescope to see these few crumbs that are nestled in the bottom of the bag? This is shrinkflation in action. So instead of the price of a good increasing, the amount of good that you get per unit of price decreases. So this is why chip bags feel emptier and emptier, or why a McDonald's Big Mac feels like a tiny snack, not a full meal. It also could be the case that I have a bigger appetite now. In some cases, it's a sneaky way to just avoid backlash on a price increase, but speaking from personal experience, just out of my own opinion here, being a receiver of a shrunken good feels like being lied to or manipulated. So anyway, either way you view shrinkflation, the effect is the same. It's that your purchasing power decreases. Now, stagflation would be another example, and it's a combination of a stagnant economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. So it's a nightmare for central banks because anything done to resolve one component exacerbates another component. So for example, fighting inflation worsens unemployment, and fighting unemployment with stimulus checks or something like that worsens inflation. And it's kind of like a checkmate. It's like a trap. So shrinkflation and stagflation aren't necessarily core concepts of inflation. They're more so related concepts that manifest as a result of inflation. Well, if you made it this far in the video, you should have a pretty solid understanding of the basics of inflation. And just to give you a recap of the whole thing, something you might want to write down if you're studying the topic. Look, at the core, inflation is the sustained increase in prices and decrease in purchasing power, typically caused by demand pull, which is caused by a high money supply, or cost push, which is caused by supply shocks, and built-in inflation, which is caused by people's expectations or imagination. Inflation is measured imperfectly using CPI, PPI, these kinds of calculations that track the change in price of fixed sets of goods, but it fails to demonstrate effects like substitution of goods or the improvement of quality of goods and services. Additionally, central banks fight inflation by adjusting the price of money in effect. They adjust the interest rates, which has the ability to cool demand, and it cuts jobs, and that's a 12 to 18 month cycle. If I could add anything else to this video which would help you understand inflation, it would be a piece of advice that it can actually be applied to anything economics oriented in general. And that is to try to think not only of initial events, but think of the second and third order consequences and the incentives that will be created as a result of any given event. So what do I mean by that? I mean, don't just think about an increase in money supply. Conceptualize the consequences that will manifest as a result. So instead of thinking just, oh, money supply, think about consequences like increased spending, higher demand, a greater burden on supply and suppliers, and then an increase in prices, and then a reduction of quality, and then an increase in inflation, and then a round of job cuts to counterbalance that initial increase of money supply. That's what I mean, second, third order consequences. Okay, at this point, you should be able to tackle any inflation headline or article and understand, with some level of like a thorough understanding of the drivers and results of inflation. So if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment, let me know what you thought, and thank you for watching.